Shizuku's Reviews, bringing you a southern perspective on books, movies, music, and much, much more. Stick around for a while, you just might hear something wicked. Hi friends, so sorry for the technical difficulties. I will get that fixed in one moment when I figure it out. Okay, here I am, and there you are. I hope y'all all had a wonderful All Saints Day yesterday. I'm sorry that I wasn't able to make the cast. I was not feeling well. I'm feeling better today, so here I am with the makeup cast for Tuesday's reads. Also, we're doing a little better with the cat situation. She's not nearly as the little cat that lost her litter. She's not. It doesn't look like she's as pained as she was now, so that's a little better. And we have all of the other cat family. They're taking their naps right now, and that's about it on the updates for the kitty family. And if you hear some galumphing around, that will be the dog. And he is inside right now because it's a little warm outside today, and he does not like the heat, as he's a very thick-coated dog. So, last week we started with Eothen, and we read up to chapter 1, which was introducing us to our protagonist and his journey across the border of the quarantined establishment to go further into the Ottoman Empire. So we shall continue with chapter 2 today. Oh, and before I forget, this author's name is Alexander Kinglake. Chapter 2. Turkish Traveling. In 2 or 3 hours, our party was ready. The servants, the Tartar, the mounted Surajis, and the baggage horses all together made up a strong cavalcade. The accomplished Misiri, of whom you have heard me speak so often, and who served me so faithfully throughout my oriental journeys, acted as our interpreter and was in fact the brain of our corps. The Tartar, you know, is a government courier properly employed in carrying dispatches, but also sent with travelers to speed them on their way and answer with his head for their safety. The man whose head was thus pledged for our precious lives was a glorious-looking fellow, with that regular and handsome cast of countenance which is now characteristic of the Ottoman race. Footnote: the continual marriages of these people with the chosen beauties of Georgia and Syriza have overpowered the original ugliness of their Tartar ancestors. His features displayed a good deal of serene pride, self-respect fortitude, a kind of ingenious sensuality, and something of instinctive wisdom, without any sharpness of intellect. He had been a janissary, as I afterwards found, and he still kept up the old Praetorian strut which used to affright the Christians in former times, a strut so comically pompous that any close imitation of it, even in the broadest farce, would be looked upon as a very rough overacting of the character. It is occasioned in part by dress and accoutrements. The weighty bundle of weapons carried upon the chest throws back the body so as to give it a wonderful portliness, and moreover the immense masses of clothes that swathe his limbs force the wearer in walking to swing himself heavily round from left to right and from right to left. In truth, this great edifice of woolen and cotton and silk and silver and brass and steel is not at all fitted for moving on foot. It cannot even walk without frightfully decomposing its fair proportions. As to running, our Tartar ran once. It was in order to pick up a partridge that Methley had winged with a pistol shot, and the attempt was one of the funniest misdirections of human energy that wandering man ever saw. But put him in his stirrups, and then is the Tartar himself again. There he lives at his pleasure, reposing in the tranquillity of the true home, the home of his ancestors, which the saddle seems to afford him, and drawing from his pipe the calm pleasures of his own fireside, or else dashing sudden over the earth, as though for a moment he felt the mouth of a Turcoman steed, and saw his own Scythian plains lying boundless and open before him. It was not till his subordinates had nearly completed their preparations for the march that our Tartar, commanding the forces, arrived. He came sleek and fresh from the bath, for so it is the custom of the Ottomans when they start upon a journey, and was carefully accoutred at every point from his thigh to his throat. He was laden with arms and other implements of campaigning life. There is no scarcity of water along the whole road from Belgrade to Stamboul, but the habits of our Tartar were formed by his ancestors and not by himself, so he took good care to see that his leathern water flask was amply charged and properly strapped to the saddle, along with his blessed tribocue. Okay. And now at last he has cursed the Surugees in all proper figures of speech, and is ready for a ride of 1,000 miles. But before he comforts his soul in the marble baths of Stamboul, he will be another and a lesser man. His sense of responsibility, his too strict abstemiousness, and his restless energy, disdainful of sleep, will have worn him down to a fraction of the sleek Mustafa, who now leads out our party from the gates of Belgrade. The Surugees are the men employed to lead the baggage horses. They are most of them gypsies. Their lot is a sad one. They are the last of the human race, and all the sins of their superiors, including the horses, can safely be visited on them, but the wretched look often more picturesque than their betters. And though all the world despised these poor Suridgees, their tawny skins and their grisly beards will gain them honorable standing in the foreground of a landscape. We had a couple of these fellows with us, each leading a baggage horse, to the tail of which last another baggage horse was attached. There was a world of trouble in persuading the stiff, angular portmanteaus of Europe to adapt themselves to their new condition and sit quietly on pack saddles. But all was right at last, and it gladdened my eyes to see our little group file off through the winding lanes of the city and show down brightly in the plain beneath. The one of our party most out of keeping with the rest of the scene was Methley's Yorkshire servant, who always rode doggedly on in his pantry jacket, looking out for our gentlemen's seats. Methley and I had English saddles, but I think we should have done just as well. I should certainly have seen more of the country if we had adopted saddles like that of our Tartar, who towered so loftily over the scraggly little beast that carried him, in taking thought for the East, whilst in England I had made one capital hit, which you must not forget. I had brought with me a pair of common spurs. These were a great comfort to me throughout my horseback travels, by keeping up the cheerfulness of the many unhappy nags that I had to bestride. The angle of the oriental stirrup is very poor substitute for spurs. The Ottoman horseman, raised by his saddle to a great height above the humble level of the back that he bestrides, and using a very sharp bit, is able to lift the crest of his nag and force him into a strangely fast shuffling walk, the orthodox pace for the journey. My comrade and I, using English saddles, could not easily keep our beasts up to his peculiar amble. Besides, we thought it a bore to be followed by our attendants for 1,000 miles, and we generally therefore did duty as the rear guard of our grand army. We used to walk our horses till the party in front had got into the distance, and then retrieve the lost ground by a gallop. We had ridden on for some 2 or 3 hours. The stir and bustle of our commencing journey had ceased. The liveliness of our little troop had worn off with the declining day, and night closed in as we entered the great Servian forest. Though this our road was to last for more than 100 miles. Endless and endless now on either side the tall oaks closed in their ranks, and stood gloomily lowering over us as grim as an army of giants with 1,000 years' pay in arrear. One strived with listening ear to catch some tiding of the forest world within, some stirring of beasts, some night bird's scream, but all was quite hushed, except the voice of the cicalas that peopled every bough and filled the depths of the forest through and through with one same hum everlasting, more stilling than very silence. And our way was in darkness, but after a while the moon got up and touched the glittering arms and tawny faces of our men with light so pale and mystic that the watchful Tartar felt bound to look out for demons and take proper means for keeping them off. Forthwith he determined that the duty of frightening away our ghostly enemies, like every other troublesome work, should fall upon the poor Suridgees. They accordingly lifted up their voices and burst upon the dreaded stillness of the forest with shrieks and dismal howls. These precautions were kept up incessantly, and were followed by the most complete success, for not one demon came near us. Long before midnight we reached the hamlet in which we were to rest for the night. It was made up of about a dozen clay huts, standing upon a small tract of ground, hardly one from the forest. The peasants living there spoke a Slavic dialect, and a Misery's knowledge of the Russian tongue enabled him to talk with them freely. We took up our quarters in a square room with white walls and an earthen floor, quite bare of furniture and utterly void of women. They told us, however, that these Servian villagers lived in happy abundance, but that they were careful to conceal their riches as well as their wives. The burdens unstrapped from the pack saddles very quickly furnished our den. A couple of quilts spread upon the floor, with a carpet bag at the head of each, became capital sofas. Portmanteaus and hat boxes and writing cases and books and maps and gleaming arms soon lay strewed around us in pleasant confusion. Misery's canteen, too, began to yield up its treasures, but we relied upon finding some provisions in the village. At first, the natives declared that their hens were mere old maids, and that all their cows unmarried, but our Tartar swore such a grand, sonorous oath, and fingered the hilt of his yataghan with such persuasive touch, that the land soon flowed with milk, and the mountains of eggs arose. And soon there was tea before us, with all its welcome fragrance. And as we reclined on the floor, we found that a portmanteau was just the right height for a table. The duty of candlesticks was ably performed by a couple of intelligent natives. The rest of the villagers stood by the open doorway at the lower end of the room, and watched our banquet with grave and devout attention. The first night of your first campaign, though you will be but a mere peaceful campaigner, is a glorious time in your life. It is so sweet to find oneself free from the stale civilization of Europe. Oh, my dear ally, when first you spread your carpet in the midst of these eastern scenes, do think for a moment of those your fellow creatures that dwell in squares and streets, and even, for such is the fate of many, in actual country houses. Think of the people that are presenting their compliments and requesting the honor, and much regretting, of those that are pinioned at dinner tables, or stuck up in ballrooms, or cruelly planted in pews. Aye, think of these. And so, remembering how many poor devils are living in a state of utter respectability, you will glory the more in your own delightful escape. But with all of its charms, a mud floor like a mercenary match does certainly promote early rising. Long before daybreak we were up and had breakfasted. Afterwards there was nearly a whole tedious hour to endure, whilst the horses were laden by torchlight. But this had an end, and then our day's journey began. Cloaked and somber, we first made our sullen way through the darkness with scarcely one barter of words. But soon the genial morn burst down from heaven, and stirred the blood so gladly through our veins that the very Suridgees, with all their troubles, could now look up for an instant and almost seem to believe in temporary goodness of God. The actual movement from one place to another in Europeanized countries is a process so temporary it occupies so small a portion of the traveler's entire time that his mind remains unsettled so long as the wheels are going. He may be alive enough to external objects of interest, and to the crowding ideas which are often invited by the excitement of a changing scene, but he is still conscious of being in a provisional state, and his mind is forever recurring to the expected end of his journey. His ordinary ways of thought have been interrupted, and before any new mental habits can be formed, he is quietly fixed in his hotel. It will be otherwise with you when you journey in the east, day after day, perhaps week after week, and month after month. Your foot is in the stirrup to taste the cold breath of the earliest morn, and to lead or follow your bright cavalcade till sunset through the forests and mountain passes, through valleys and desolate plains. All this becomes your mode of life, and you ride, eat, drink, and curse the mosquitoes as systematically as your friends in England eat, drink, and sleep. If you are wise, you will not look upon the long period of time thus occupied in actual movement as the mere gulf dividing you from the end of your journey, but rather as one of those rare and plastic seasons of your life, from which, perhaps in after times, you may love to date the molding of your character, that is, your very identity. Once feel this, and you will soon grow happy and contented in your saddle home. As for me and my comrade, however, in this part of our journey, we often forgot Strambul, forgot all of the Ottoman Empire, and only remembered old times. We went back, loitering on the banks of the Thames, not grim old Thames of life after all, of afterlife, that washes the Parliament houses and drowns despairing girls, but Thames of old Eothen fellow, that wrestled with us in our boyhood till he taught us to be stronger than he. We bullied Keith and scoffed at Larry Miller and Okies. We rode along, loudly laughing, and talked to the grave Servian forest as though it were the Brockus clump. Our pace was commonly very slow, for the baggage horses served us for a drag, and kept us to a rate of little more than 5 miles in the hour. But now and then, and chiefly at night, a spirit of movement would suddenly animate the whole party. The baggage horses would be teased into a gallop, and when once this was done, there would be such a banging of portmanteaus and such convulsions of carpet-bags upon their panting sides, and the surgeons would follow them up with such a hurricane of blows and screams and curses that stopping or relaxing was scarcely possible. Then the rest of us would put our horses into a gallop, and so, all shouting cheerily, would hunt and drive the sumpter beasts, like a flock of goats, up a hill and down a dale, right on to the end of their journey. The distances between our relays of horses varied greatly. Some were not more than 15 or 20 miles, but twice, I think, we performed a whole day's journey of more than 60 miles with the same beasts. When at last we came out from the forest, our road lay through scenes like those of an English park. The green sward unfenced, and left to the free pasture of cattle, was dotted with groups of stately trees, and here and there darkened over with larger masses of wood that seemed gathered together for bounding the domain. and shutting out some of the infernal fellow creatures in the shape of a newly made squire. In one or two spots, the hanging copses looked down upon a lawn below with such sheltering mane that, seeing the like in England, you would have been tempted almost to ask the name of the spendthrift or the madman who had dared to pull down the old hall. There are few countries less infested by lions than the provinces on this part of your route. You are not called upon to drop a tear over the tomb of the once brilliant anybody, or pay your tribute of respect to anything dead or alive. There are no Servian or Bulgarian literatures with whom it would be positively disgraceful not to form an acquaintance. You have no staring, no praising to get through. The only public building of any interest that lies on the road is of modern date, but is said to be a good specimen of Oriental architecture. It is of pyramidical shape and is made up of 30,000 skulls contributed by the rebellious Servians in the early part, I believe, of this century. I am not all sure of my date, but I fancy that it was the year 1806 that the first skull was laid. I am ashamed to say that in the darkness of the early morning we unknowingly went by the neighborhood of this triumph of art, and so basely got off from admiring the simple grandeur of the architect's conception and the exquisite beauty of the fretwork. There being no lions, we ought at least to have met with a few perils, but the only robbers we saw anything of have been long since dead and gone. The poor fellows had been impaled upon high poles, and so propped up by the traverse spokes beneath them, that their skeletons, clothed with some white wax-like remains of flesh, still sat up lolling in the sunshine and listlessly stared without eyes. One day it seemed to me that our path was little more rugged than usual, and I found that I was deserving for myself the title of Subalkansky, or Transcender of the Balkan. The truth is that, as a military barrier, the Balkan is a fabulous mountain which seems to be the view of Major Keppel, who looked on it towards the east with the eye of a soldier. And certainly in the Sofia Pass there is no narrow defile and no ascent sufficiently difficult to stop or delay for a long time a train of siege artillery. Before we reached Adrianople, Methley had been seized with we knew not what ailment, and when we had taken up our quarters in the city, he was cast to the very earth by sickness. Adrianople enjoyed an English consul, and I felt sure that, in Eastern phrase, his house would cease to be his house, and would become the house of my sick comrade. I should have judged rightly under ordinary circumstances, but the levelling plague was abroad, and the dread of it had dominion over the consular mind, so now, whether dying or not, one could hardly tell. Upon a quilt stretched out along the floor, there lay the best hope of an ancient line, without the material aids to comfort of even the humblest sort, and sad to say, without the consolation of a friend, or even a comrade worth having. I have a notion that tenderness and pity are affections occasioned in some measure by living within doors, certainly. At the time I speak of, the open-air life which I had been leading or the wayfaring hardships of the journey had so strangely blunted me that I felt intolerant of illness and looked down upon my companion as if the poor fellow, in falling ill, had betrayed a want of spirit. I entertained, too, a most absurd idea, an idea that his illness was partly affected. You see that I have made a confession. This I hope, that I may hereafter look charitably upon the hard, savage acts of peasants and the cruelties of a brutal soldiery. God knows that I have strived to melt myself into common charity and to put on a gentleness which I could not feel. But this attempt did not cheat the keenness of the sufferer. He could not have felt the less deserted because that I was with him. We called to aid a solemn Armenian, I think he was, half soothsayer, half hakim or doctor, who, all the while counting his beads, fixed his eyes steadily upon the patient and then suddenly dealt him a violent blow on his chest. Methley bravely dissembled his pain, for he fancied that the blow was meant to try to whether or not the plague were on him. Here was really a sad embarrassment. No bed, no nothing to offer the invalid in the shape of food, save a piece of thin, tough, flexible, drab-colored cloth, made of flour and millstones in equal proportions, and called it by the name of bread. Then the patient, of course, had no confidence in his medical man, and on the whole, the best chance of saving my comrade seemed to lie in taking him out of reach of his doctor, and bearing him away to the neighborhood of some more genial consul. But how was this to be done? Methley was much too ill to be kept in his saddle, and wheel carriages as means of traveling were unknown. There is, however, such a thing as an araba, a vehicle drawn by oxen, in which the wives of rich men are sometimes dragged 4 or 5 miles over the grass by way of recreation. The carriage is rudely framed, but you recognize in the simple grandeur of its design a likeness to things majestic. In short, if your carpenter's son were to make a Lord Mayor's coach for little Aunt Amy, he would build a carriage very much in the style of the Turkish araba. No one had ever heard of horses being used for drawing a carriage in this part of the world, but necessity is the mother of innovation as well as of invention. I was fully justified, I think, in arguing that there were numerous instances of horses being used for that purpose in our country, that the laws of nature are uniform in their operation over all the world except Ireland, that which was true in Piccadilly must be true in Adrianople, that the matter could not fairly be treated as an ecclesiastical question, for that the circumstance of Methley's going on to Stromboli in an araba drawn by horses, when calmly and dispassionately considered, would appear to be perfectly consistent with the maintenance of the Mahometan region, as by law established. Thus poor dear patient reason would have fought her slow battle against Asiatic prejudice, and I am convinced that she would have established the possibility, and perhaps even the propriety, of harnessing horses in 150 years. But in the meantime, Mysseri was seconded by our Tartar, contrived to bring the controversy to a premature end by having horses put to It was a sore thing for me to see my poor comrade brought to this, for young though he was a veteran in travel. When scarcely yet of age, he had invaded India from the frontiers of Russia, and that so swiftly that, measuring by the time of his flight the broad dominions of the King of Kings, were shriveled up to a dukedom, and now, poor fellow, he was to be poked into an araba like a Georgian girl. He suffered greatly, for there were no springs for the carriage, and no road for the wheels, and so the concern jolted on over the open country with such twists and jerks and jumps as might most dislocate the supple tongue of Satan. All day the patient kept himself shut up within the lattice work of the araba, and I could hardly know how he was faring until the end of the day's journey, when I found that he was not worse. He was buoyed up with the hope of some day reaching Constantinople. I was always conning over my maps, and fancied that I knew pretty well my line, but after Adrianople I had made more southing than I knew for, and it was with unbelieving wonder and delight that I came suddenly upon the shore of the sea a little while, and its gentle billows were flowing beneath the hoofs of my beasts. But the hearing of the ripple was not enough communion, and the seeing of the blue Propontis was not to know and possess it. I must needs plunge into its depth, and quench my longing love for the palpable waves. And so when old Mustafa, defender against demons, looked round for his charge, he saw with horror and dismay that he, for whose life his own life stood pledged, was possessed of some devil who had driven him down into the sea, that the rider and the seed had vanished from the earth, and that out among the waves was the gasping crest of a post horse, and the ghostly head of the Englishman moving upon the face of the waters. He started very early indeed, on the last day of our journey, and from the moment of being off until we gained the shelter of the imperial walls, we were struggling face to face with an icy storm that swept right down from the steppes of Tartary, keen, fierce, and steady as a northern conqueror. Methley's servant, who was the greatest sufferer, kept his saddle until we reached Strombul, but was then found to be quite benumbed in limbs, and his brain was so much affected that when he was lifted from his horse he fell away in a state of unconsciousness, the first stage of a dangerous fever. Our Tartar, worn down by care and toil, and carrying 7 heavens under full of water in his manifold jackets and shawls, was mere weak and vapid dilution of the sleek Mustafa, who scarce more than 1 fortnight before came out like a bridegroom from his chamber to take the command of our party. Mysseri seemed somewhat overwearied, but he had lost none of his strangely quiet energy. He wore a grave look, however, for he now had learnt that the plague was prevailing at Constantinople, and he was fearing that our 2 sick men and the miserable looks of our whole party might make us unwelcome at Petra. We crossed the Golden Horn in a kayak. As soon as we had landed, some woe-begone looking fellows were got together and laden with our baggage. Then on we went, dripping and sloshing and looking very like men that had been turned back by the Royal Humane Society for being incurably drowned. Supporting our sick, we climbed up shelving steps and threaded many windings, and at last came into the main street of Pera, humbly hoping that we might not be judged guilty of the plague, and so be cast back with horror from the doors of the shuddering Christians. Such was the condition of the little troop which 15 days before had filed away so gaily from the gates of Belgrade. A couple of fevers and a northeasterly storm had thoroughly spoiled our looks. The interest of Messeri with the house of Giuseppini was too powerful to be denied, and at once, though not without fear and trembling, we were admitted as guests. And that's it for chapter 2 of Eothen, and we will continue next time on our Tuesday reads, chapter 3, Constantinople. So, carrying on, we will continue with our next Tuesday read, the Book of Brave Deeds. And this is, we're going to the second story, called The Pass of Thermopylae, or Thermopylae, whichever pronunciation. But we have a book plate in this one. The Pass of Thermopylae, from a Book of Golden Deeds by C.M. Young. There was trembling in Greece. The great king, as the Greeks called the chief of potentate of the East, whose domains stretched from the Indian Caucasus to the Aegeus, from the Caspian to the Red Sea, was marshalling his forces against the little free states that nestled amid the rocks and gulfs of the eastern Mediterranean. Already had his might devoured the cherished colonies of the Greeks on the eastern shore of the archipelago, and every traitor to home institutions found a ready asylum at that despotic court, and tried to revenge his own wrongs by whispering incitements to invasion. All people, nations, and languages was the commencement of the decrees of that monarch's court, and it was scarcely a vain boast, for his satraps ruled over the subject kingdoms, and among his tributary nations he counted the Chaldean, with his learning and old civilization, the wise and steadfast Jew, the skillful Phoenician and learned Egyptian, the wild freebooting Arab of the desert, the dark-skinned Ethiopian, And all these ruled the keen-witted, active native Persian race. The conquerors of all of the rest, and led by a chosen band proudly called the Immortals. His many capitals, Babylon the Great, Susa, Persepolis, Polis, and the like, were names of dreamy splendor to the Greeks, described now and then by the Ironians or Eonians from Asia Minor, who had carried their tribute to the king's own feet, or by courier slaves who had escaped with difficulty from being all too serviceable at the tyrannic court. And the lord of this enormous empire was about to launch his countless host against the little cluster of states, the whole of which together would hardly equal one province of huge Asiatic realm. Moreover, it was the war not only on the men but on their gods. The Persians were zealous adorers of the sun and of fire. They abhorred the idol worship of the Greeks, and defiled and plundered every temple that they fell in their way. Death and desolation were almost the best that could be looked for at such hands. Slavery and torture from cruelly barbarous masters would only too surely be the lot of the numbers, should their land fall prey to the conquerors. True, it was that 10 years back the former great king had sent his best troops to the signally defeated upon the coast of Attica. But the losses at Marathon had but stimulated the Persian lust of conquest, and the new king Xerxes was gathering together such myriads of men as should crush down the Greeks and overrun their country by mere force of numbers. The muster place was at Sardis, and their Greek spies had seen the multitudes assembling, and that state and magnificence of the king's attendants. Envoys had come from him to demand earth and water from each state in Greece, as emblems that land and sea were his. But each state was resolved to be free, and only Thessaly, that which lay first in his path, consented to yield the token of subjugation. A council was held at Isthmus of Corinth, and attended by deputies from all the states of Greece, to consider the best means of defense. The ships of the enemy would coast round the shores of the Aegean Sea. The land army would cross at Hellespont on a bridge of boats lashed together and march southwards into Greece. The only hope of averting the danger lay in defending the passages, as, from the nature of the ground, were so narrow that only a few persons could fight hand to hand at once, so that courage would be more avail than numbers. The first of these passes was called Tempe, and a body of troops was sent to guard it, but they found that this was useless and impossible, and came back again. The next was at Thermopylae. Look in your map of the archipelago, or the Aegean Sea, as it was then called, for the great island of Nigerpont, or by its old name, Euboea. It looks like a piece of broken off from the coast, and to the north is shaped like the head of a bird, with the beak running into a gulf that would fit over it, upon the mainland and between the island. And the coast is an exceedingly narrow strait, the Persian army would have to march round the edge of the gulf. They could not cut straight across the country, because the ridge of the mountains called Eta rose up and barred the way. Indeed, the woods, rocks, and precipices came down so near the seashore that in 2 places there was only room for a single wheel track between the steeps and the impassable morass that formed the border of the gulf on its south side. These 2 very narrow places were called the gates of the pass, and were about a mile apart. There was a little more width left in the intervening space, but in this there were a number of springs of warm mineral water, salt and sulphurous, which were used for the sick to bathe in, and thus the place was called Thermopylae, or the Hot Gates. A wall had once been built across the westernmost of these narrow places when the Thessalonians and the Phoenicians, who lived on either side of it, had been at war with one another. But it had been allowed to go to decay, since the Phoenicians had found out that there was a very steep, narrow mountain path along the bed of a torrent, by which it was possible to cross from one territory to another without going round this marshy coast road. This was therefore an excellent place to defend. The Greek ships were all drawn up on the further side of Euboea to prevent the Persian vessels from getting into the strait and landing men beyond the pass, and a division of the army was sent off to guard the Hot Gates. The council at the isthmus did not know of the mountain pathway, and thought that it would be safe as long as the Persians were kept out of the coast path. The troops sent for this purpose were from different cities, and amounted to about 4,000, who were to keep the pass against 2 millions. The leader of them was Leonidas, who had newly become one of the 2 kings of Sparta, the city that above all in Greece trained its arms to be hardy soldiers, dreading death infinitely less than shame. Leonidas had already made up his mind that the expedition would probably be his death. Perhaps a prophecy had been given at the temple at Delphi that Sparta would be saved by the death of one of her kings of the race of Hercules. He was allowed by law to take with him 300 men, and these he chose most carefully, not merely for their strength and courage, but selecting those who had sons, so that no family might be altogether destroyed. These Spartans, with their helots or slaves, made up his own share of the numbers. But all the army was under his generalship. It is even said that the 300 celebrated their own funeral rites before they set out, lest they should be deprived of them by the enemy, since, as we have already seen, it was the Greek belief that the spirits of the dead found no rest till their obsequies had been performed. Such preparations did not daunt the spirits of Leonidas and his men, and his wife Gorgo was not a woman to be faint-hearted or hold him back. Long before, when she was a very little girl, a word of hers had saved her father from listening to a traitorous message from the kings of Persia. And every Spartan lady was bred up to be able to say those she best loved that they must come home from battle with the shield or on it, either carrying it victoriously or borne upon it as a corpse. When Leonidas came to Thermopylae, the Phoenicians told him of the mountain path through the chestnut woods of Mount Eta, and begged to have the privilege of guarding it on the spot high up on the mountain side, assuring him that it was very hard to find at the other end, and that there was every probability that the enemy would never discover it. He consented, and encamping around the warm springs, caused the broken wall to be repaired, and made ready to meet the foe. The Persian army were seen covering the whole country like locusts, and the hearts of some of the southern Greeks in the pass began to sink. Their homes in the Peloponnese were comparatively secure. They had better not fall back and reserve themselves to defend Isthmus or of Corinth. But Leonidas, though Sparta was safe below the Isthmus, had no intention of abandoning his northern allies, and kept the other Peloponnesians to their posts, only sending messengers for further help. Presently a Persian on horseback rode up to reconnoiter the pass. He could not see over the wall, but in front of it, and on the ramparts, he saw the Spartans, some of them engaged in active sports, and others in combing their long hair. He rode back to the king, and told him what he had seen. Now Xerxes in his camp had an exiled Spartan prince named Demaratus, who had become a traitor to his country and was serving as counselor to the enemy. Xerxes sent for him and asked whether his countrymen were mad to be thus employed instead of fleeing away. But Demaratus made answer that a hard fight was no doubt in preparation, and that it was the custom of the Spartans to array their hair with especial care when they were about to enter upon any great peril. Xerxes would, however, not believe that so petty a force could intend to resist him, and waited 4 days, probably expecting his fleet to assist him. But as it did not appear, the attack was made. The Greeks, stronger men and more heavily armed, were far better able to fight to advantage than the Persians, with their short spears and wicker shields, and beat them off with great ease. It is said that Xerxes 3 times leapt off his throne in despair at the sight of his troops being driven backwards, and thus for 2 days it seemed as easy to force a way through the Spartans as though the rocks themselves. Nay, how could slavish troops, dragged from home to spread the victories of an ambitious king, fight like freemen who felt that their strokes were to defend their homes and children? But on that evening a wretched man crept into the Persian camp and offered for a great sum of money to show the mountain path that would enable the enemy to take the brave defenders in the rear. A Persian general named Hydarnes was sent off at the nightfall with a detachment to secure this passage, and was guided through this thick forest that clothed the hillside. In the stillness of the air at daybreak, the Phocian guides of the path were startled by the crackling of the chestnut leaves under the tread of many feet. They started up, but a shower of arrows were discharged on them, and forgetting all save the present alarm, they fled to a higher part of the mountain, and the enemy, without waiting to pursue them, began to descend. As day dawned, morning light showed the watchers of the Grecian camp below a glittering and shimmering in the torrent bed where their shaggy forests opened. But it was not the sparkle of water, but the shine of gilded helmets and the gleaming of silvered spears. Moreover, Cimmerian crept over to the wall from the Persian camp with tidings that the path had been betrayed, that the enemy were climbing it, and they would come down beyond the eastern gate. Still, the way was rugged and circuitous. The Persians would hardly descend before midday, and there was ample time for the Greeks to escape before they could thus be shut in by the enemy. There was a short council held over the morning sacrifice. Megistias, the seer, on inspecting the entrails of the slain victim, declared, as well he might, that their appearance boded disaster. Him Leonidas ordered to retire, but he refused, though he sent home his only son. There was no disgrace to an ordinary tone of mind in leaving a post that could not be held, and Leonidas recommended all the allied troops under his command to march away while yet the way was open. As to himself and his Spartans, they had made up their mind to die at their post, and there would be no doubt that the example of such a resolution would do more to save Greece than their best efforts could ever do. They were careful to reserve themselves for another occasion. All the allies consented to retreat, except the 80 men who came from Mycenae, and the 700 Thespians, who declared that they would not desert Leonidas. There were also 400 Thebans who remained, and thus the whole number that stayed with Leonidas to confront 2 million of enemies were 1,400 warriors, besides the helots or attendants on the 300 Spartans, whose number is not known. But there was probably at least one to each. Leonidas had 2 kinsmen in the camp, like himself, claiming the blood of Hercules, and he tried to save them by giving them letters and messages to Sparta. But the one answered that he had come to fight, not to carry letters, and the other that his deeds would tell all that Sparta wished to know. Another Spartan named hold on, you'll have to bear with me. Dionysus, named Dionysus, when told that the enemy's archers were so numerous that their arrows darkened the sun, replied, "So much better, we shall fight in the shade." 2 of the 300 had been sent to a neighboring village, suffering severely from some complaint in the eyes. One of them, called Eurystus, put on his armor and commanded his helot to lead him to his place in the ranks. The other, called Aristodemus, was so overpowered with illness that he allowed himself to be carried away with the retreating allies. It was still early in the day when all were gone, and Leonidas gave the word to his men to take their last meal. "Tonight," he said, "we shall sup with Pluto." Hitherto he had stood on the defensive and had husbanded the lives of his men. But he now desired to make as great a slaughter as possible, so as to inspire the enemy with the dread of the Grecian name. He therefore marched out beyond the wall without waiting to be attacked, and the battle began. The Persian captains went behind their wretched troops and scourged them onto the fight with whips. Poor wretches, they were driven on to be slaughtered, pierced with the Greek spears, hurled into the sea, or trampled into the mud of the morass. But their inexhaustible numbers told at length. The spears of the Greeks broke under hard service, and their swords alone remained. They began to fall, and Leonidas himself was among the first of the slain. Hotter than ever was the fight over his corpse, and 2 Persian princes, brothers of Xerxes, were there killed. But at length word was brought that Hydarnes was over the pass, and that the few remaining men were thus enclosed on all sides. The Spartans and Thespians made their way to a little hillock within the wall, resolved to let this be the place of their last stand. But the hearts of the Thebans failed them, and they came towards the Persians, holding out their hands in entreaty for mercy. Quarter was given to them, but they were all branded with the king's mark as untrustworthy deserters. The Helots probably at this time escaped into the mountains, while the small desperate band stood side by side on the hill, still fighting to the last, some with swords, others with daggers, others even with their hands and teeth, till not one living man remained amongst them. When the sun went down, there was only a mound of slain, bristled over with arrows. 20,000 Persians had died before that handful of men. Xerxes asked Democritus if there were many more at Sparta like this, and was told there were 8,000. It must have been with a somewhat failing heart that he invited his courtiers from the fleet to see what he had done to men who dared to oppose him, and showed them the head and arm of Leonidas set up upon a cross. But he took care that all his own slain, except 1,000, should first be put out of sight. The body of the brave king was buried where he fell, as those were those of the other dead. Much envied were they by the unhappy Astradamus, who found himself called by no name but the coward, and was shunned by all his fellow citizens. No one would give him fire or water, and after a year of misery he redeemed his honor by perishing in the forefront of the battle of Plataea, which was given the last blow that drove the Persians ingloriously from Greece. The Greeks then united in doing honor to the brave warriors who, had they been better supported, might have saved the whole country from invasion. The poet Simonides wrote the inscriptions that were engraved upon the pillars that were set in the past to commemorate this great action. One was outside the wall, where most of the fighting had been. It seemed to have been in honor of the whole number who had for 2 days resisted. Here did 4,000 men from Pelops' land against 300 myriads bravely stand. In honor of the Spartans was another column. Go, traveler, to Sparta tell, and here obeying her we fell. On the little hillock of the last resistance was placed the figure of a stone lion. In the memory of Leonidas, so fitly named, the lion-like, and Simonides at his own expense erected a pillar to his friend, the seer Megistias. The great Megistias' tomb you here may view, who slew the Medes fresh from Sperseus fords. Well the wise seer the coming death foreknew, yet scorned he to forsake his Spartan lords. The names of the 300 were likewise engraven on a pillar at Sparta. Lion, pillars, and inscriptions have all long since passed away. Even the very spot itself has changed. New soil has been formed, and there are miles of solid ground between Mount Etna and the Gulf, so that the hot gates no longer exist, but more enduring than stone or brass, nay, than the very battlefield itself, has been the name of Leonidas. 2,300 years have sped since he braced himself to perish for his country's sake in that narrow, marshy coast road, under the brow of the wooded crags, with the sea by his side. Since that time, how many hearts have glowed, how many arms have been nerved at the remembrance of the pass of Thermopylae, and the defeat that was worth so much more than his victory. And our last illustration, small one. So that was the Pass of Thermopylae, and if you've seen, I think it's the movie called 300. I'm not sure, I haven't seen the movie myself, but I believe that the movie 300 is based off of the Pass of Thermopylae. I could be a little wrong, but I do know that one of the characters in the was named King Xerxes and the other Leonidas. So I'm pretty sure that it was about that battle. So I'm putting that on my to watch list eventually. And I will be right back after this short break, and we'll hope that you join me after. And we will continue with some H.G. Wells' outline of history. Be right back. And welcome back. I hope you were able to get everything that you needed during your break. So I'll be continuing on with The Outline of History by H.G. Wells, Volume 1. And the reason I'm going through like the introductions and whatnot is because it's very important to actually know what their aim was during the duration while they were writing this. What was their intention. And sometimes you really can't find what their intention was in all of these big long introductions, but it's also very telling in some of them. And we will be continuing on the Outline of History's Its Story and Aim Part 2 today. So, continuing on to the chief purpose of revision of 1930 was to make the outline simpler and easier to read. The writer has told of how it grew out of notes and maps, and he will confess that now when he turns over the earlier editions, the first edition that was published in parts, the first book edition of 1920, he finds the flavor of notebooks altogether too strong. Much undigested and discordant matter was put into footnotes. There were far too many hesitating, ambiguous, and guarded statements. The presentation was sometimes confused, and the method he pursued led naturally to that. He called into his aid 4 chief helpers, Sir Ray Lancaster, Professor Gilbert Murray, Sir Harry Johnston, and Mr. Ernest Barker, and he made them his advisors upon his readings and sources of information. In addition, he secured the help and advice of various specially well-read men upon this or that point or region. Sir Denison Ross, Mr. Kramer Byng, and Mr. S. N. Fu, for example, were extremely helpful in regards to Central Asia and China. Dr. Charles Singer gave the most useful information upon classical science. Professor J. L. Myers was a valuable source for Mediterranean archaeology. Mr. Philip Guedalla was his counselor upon European politics in the 18th and early 19th centuries, and so forth and so on. Mr. J. F. Horrobin, with his genius for political and commercial geography, was not so much an illustrator as a collaborator. There were many who gave their time and knowledge freely and generously. There are full lists of names in the previous editions. One hesitates between acknowledging one's obligations and implicating one's friend. Each chapter was first drafted by the author. Multiple copies were made and sent out to all the possible helpers, who wrote, commented, and slashed about upon them as they thought proper. The author then sat down, chastened and instructed amidst these mutilated and butchered duplicates, and wrote his chapter afresh. Finally, proofs went out to all the chief helpers and to anyone else especially interested in the period dealt with. In this way, the correctness of names, dates, and so forth was ensured. But through the writer, upon all questions of fact followed with absolute fidelity, and the band of tutors he had invoked. He reserved to himself the fullest rights of private judgment upon matters of opinion. The result was the introduction of various lively controversies into the clustering footnotes and even into the text. For example, he fell foul of Professor Gilbert Murray in a comparison of moral and intellectual quality of the common Athenian and of the Cockney. And though he conceded to his editor the completest intimacy with the former, he maintained his right to judge the latter in his own fashion. There was also a page or so of disputation between the writer, Professor Murray, and Mr. Barker about the soundness of Mr. Gladstone's education, and various differences with Mr. Ernest Barker. To the writer, the greatness of Napoleon I is a monstrous and altogether unsubstantial superstition. The facts, he thinks, speak for themselves, and they will be given in this outline in their proper place and proportion. The man was of the quality of Mussolini, and intellectually inferior to Napoleon III, but Mr. Barker was unable to accept this statement. "Put me down of the opposite opinion," he wrote. So the footnote stood. Sir Harry Johnson's weakness, or rather his excessive strength, lay in the abnormal, though no doubt righteous, spelling of well-known historical names. He would have Solomon, and Hebrews, Ibram, which seemed likely to be difficult and confusing for the ordinary reader. That issue also flowered into footnotes. These footnotes were as amusing to the writer and his friends as family jokes, and they were almost inevitable while the names of the 4 chief helpers stood with the writers upon the title page, upholding and in a way guaranteeing it. But they were perplexing and tedious to most readers. Footnotes, references, and qualifications are necessary things in a book written for the student. But in this outline, they were superfluous, and even the writer now confesses a little pretentious. In this edition, he releases his 4 chief helpers with gratitude from all further responsibility. Their names disappear from the title page. He drops his pilots. They have steered him past dangerous shoals and along tortuous channels to his present freedom and confidence. And so helped and liberated, he is able to simplify, clarify, and give its fullest values to his great story of their kindness made it possible for him to tell. The 1930 edition was the 6th complete reprinting of this work. The first publication in parts subjected its chapter by chapter to the scrutiny of over 100,000 readers. Many wrote offering comments, pointing out small errors, raising interesting points. All this correspondence was dealt with systematically, and the first book edition benefited greatly in detail. That also went out to a great multitude of readers. In America alone, over 250,000 copies were issued, and that again produced an abundant crop of emendations. That edition also evoked many able reviews, and several critical pamphlets appeared. The second book edition in 1923, the third edition, that is, profited greatly by the second extensive examination. In addition to such revisions of detail, the chapters of the third edition were rearranged. For some time, the author had felt that his account of the Aryan culture came too early and minimalized the share of the non-Aryan folk in the development of civilization. He altered the order of the earlier chapters so as to correct this effect. He also inserted a fuller account of Lincoln and the American Civil War. The edition of 1930 involved still further additions and revisions. It has been purged of footnotes and digressions, and made more explicit, more fluent, and more continuous than its predecessors. The disputes of the collaborators are no longer heard from behind the scenes. It has, the writer hopes, lost its last traces of the student's notebook and has become plainly and simply an outline of history. The reader of this book need be in no doubt about the facts, the names, the dates that are given here. After the test of these scrutinies and revisions, the book has been severely criticized, but never on the score of its general accuracy. Even so, inveterate and antagonist of the writer, as Mr. Belloc, has conceded it that much merit. The objections made concern the relative prominence given to this part or that, to the influence of this culture or the importance of that. My eyes are going wonky. Hold on just a second. The objections made concern the relative prominence given to this part or that, to the influence of this culture, or the importance of that. A certain type of classical scholar rages at the comparative neglect of Homer and the aesthetic side of Greek life through the account of the Greek sciences, though the account of Greek science is full, and through the intellectual development of Greece is treated as a cardinal phase in the human development. Another large body of opinion sees the world through Latin forms, and is exacerbated even by the simple statement of the comparative extent, duration, and influence of it. For instance, the Byzantine, Persian, and Chinese systems. Rome is still aggressive in modern literature and criticism, and still seeks to minimize the non-Latin spaces in the picture. Dogmatic freethinkers again consider the acceptance of Jesus as a real person insupportable. Adherents of Islam cry out against the too familiar handling of their prophet. Communists are often offended because the doctrines of Marx and Lenin are not made the basis of the entire story. Many people with a rather materialistic theology in minds have been disagreeably impressed by the massed and accumulating evidences of man's animal descent. Even if that be true, they think it highly demoralizing. Such criticisms were inevitable. There was no way of evading or satisfying these demands. One realizes in the face of such attitudes and objections that nearly every one has already a sort of implicit outline of history in his mind, his working explanation of his world and of his place in the world. Rejecting this view and assuming that, and more or less clearly minded, he brings our version to the test of these half-buried acceptances. And naturally, the writer too has his view, his bias, but the reader will never find a writer who has not that much personality. There will never be an outline of history written that is not tendential. Here, as in every sort of descriptive and informative book, the reader has to bear in mind, just as a judge or a juryman has to bear in mind, the individual characteristics of the witness who is giving his account of what he saw. What is claimed here is that the witness does, to the best of his ability, tender a fair and honest general account from his point of view of the great spectacle of time and fate that has unfolded itself before him. I'm going to go ahead and read 3 today, as it's only half a page long. In the criticism of the earlier editions of this outline, the complaint was frequently repeated that the development of the arts, and particularly of music, was disregarded. The story of man's achievement of knowledge and social power was given at considerable length, but hardly anything was said of the appearance and extension of his conscious search for beauty. An attempt has been made since 1930 to meet these objections, and sections have been added to record how the artist, the poet, and the imaginative writer appeared in human life. Yet the limitations upon any history of music or any other art are very narrow. One may note that the appearance of new forms, new methods, new instruments, but the only way to the realization of imaginative arts is to hear it, or see it, or read it. It is no part of our plan to catalog masters and masterpieces, and help our readers to babble great names. Additions have been made necessary by the progress of the excavator. It is hard nowadays for the writer to keep pace with the spade. Moreover, it has been necessary to scrutinize the account of the First World War closely, and to rewrite the post-war portion. That was much the weakest part of the preceding editions. The exciting hopes and stresses of this time were too close for restrained writing. There was a lack of proportion between this conclusion and the rest of the book. Speeches by Mr. Lloyd George, the perfidies of the Irish struggle, lectures by obscure generals at the United Service Institution, loomed portentous, something of the pamphleteer, and a fresh attempt to give a sounder analysis of the world outlook has been made. It is not only in the political field that things have had to be thought out again. The nature of the financial and economic difficulties of the world has become much plainer now than it was before the crisis of 1929, and this again has necessitated very careful revision. And that is the end of that section, and we will continue more on its story and aim 4 and 5 the next time we have a Tuesday read. But it's quite strange reading this particular read, because I've read The Time Machine, and I've read a few others from H.G. Wells. He's The War of the Worlds, and it's strange to read Wells nonfiction because of how his vocabulary completely overtakes what we see and hear in modern conversation every day. And I find it strange that we don't use some of these words anymore, and I get really strange looks when I go out and I use a word that hasn't been used in a really long time, and I'm sitting there thinking, what? Do you not understand what that means? And I have to stop myself, and I have to say to myself, no, they don't know what it means. And I'm really saddened by that. I our education system to step up. I really do. And it's not by technological means. Then I want you to step up. I want you to step up by actual content. And I want not just my children, I want everyone's children in this country of America to be back at the level that we were with the founding fathers. So, I'm going to carry on with Norton Anthology, American Literature, this afternoon. And this section that I'm going to read is a small biography, a few biographical pages on Christopher Columbus, because I really think that we need to cover this. And because we are coming up on Thanksgiving, and we also just had Columbus Day last month, which has been changed to Indigenous Peoples Day for the name, which I will keep my opinion to myself on that. So, going on. Christopher Columbus, 1451 to 1506. Born into a family of wool workers near the once supreme Mediterranean port of Genoa, Christopher Columbus followed that rather sedentary trade for a time. But by his early adulthood, he had left wool, Genoa, and the land itself behind, venturing onto the broad Atlantic, north to England and perhaps beyond, and south along the African shore as far as the Gold Coast. During this time, he began to develop a plan. Forgive me, my eyes are jumping again. Venturing on to the broad Atlantic, north to England and perhaps beyond, and south along the African shore as far as the Gold Coast. During this time, he began to develop a plan to find a new, commercially viable route to Asia by sailing west across the ocean. For 8 years, he sought support for such a journey. Then, in 1492, the Spanish monarchs, Ferdinand and Isabella, having just defeated the last of Spain's Moorish rulers at Granada, finally agreed to back Columbus's enterprise of the Indies. He made a quick passage across the sea, anxiously watching for signs of land, until at 2 in the morning of October 12th, the sailor Juan Rodriguez Bermejo saw the outline of one of the Bahamas Islands, and the 3 ships shortened sail and waited for daylight. After sunrise, some naked people appeared on the beach as Columbus and the others came ashore, carrying the royal standard and his own ship's banners. On this island of Guanahani and others, including Juana and Hispaniola, now known as Cuba and Hispaniola, he marveled at the natural scene. My eyes never weary of looking on this fine vegetation, and found the Taino Indians to be of a very acute intelligence, a people so guileless and so generous that although naturally timid, they approached the strangers and gave them anything they had, carried away on a flood of superlatives. Columbus even thought he had heard European nightingales singing in the warm Caribbean autumn, although the newness of everything in this green paradise left him unable to identify few actual commodities. He kept a sharp eye out for anything he might take home, and by the time he returned to Spain in early January 1493, he took many specimens with him, including several of the Taino Indians, the flagship Santa Maria having been lost in a wreck off of Hispaniola on Christmas Day. He left the 40-man crew of the unlucky vessel as a colony there, confident that even if the peaceable Tainos should turn against La Navidad, the Nativity, named for the day of the shipwreck, the well-armed Europeans could easily defend themselves. All seemed peaceful as the two remaining vessels took their leave of Guacanare. The friendly Taino chieftain in the vicinity of La Navidad on January 2nd, 1493. When Columbus returned to Hispaniola on his second voyage in November 1493, at the head of a fleet of 17 ships crammed with 12 to 1,500 men, La Navidad was in ruins, and all the settlers were dead, although the greed of La Navidad's settlers for gold and women was revealed as the motive for their annihilation by the Tainos. This bloody prelude to Spain's New World Empire accurately forecast much that was to follow. By the time Columbus left his new Hispaniola settlement of Isabela in April 1494 to explore Cuba and Jamaica, signs of disorder had appeared, and by the time he returned that August, wholesale disorder was the norm. Columbus sought to restore some control, but he made the strange mistake of punishing the Tainos who had resisted abuse by renegade Spaniards, seizing them and enslaving them as rebels, and then subjugating the island's whole population. With some irony, he was forced to leave for Spain again in March 1496 to answer charges made against him by some of the Spanish renegades. Having cleared his name of the worst slanders in Spain, Columbus mounted a third journey in 1498, sailing south until he encountered the mainland of South America near the Orinoco Delta in modern Venezuela. He increasingly absorbed in religious speculations and afflicted with arthritis and severe eye trouble. Columbus took the vast outflow of fresh water as proof that he was near the site of the terrestrial paradise from which 4 great rivers were said to flow, and he proclaimed that God had made him the messenger of the new heaven and earth. The book of Revelation, meanwhile, of the book of Revelation. Meanwhile, the new earth of Hispaniola fell ever deeper into hellish state marked by outright rebellion among the Spaniards and uprising among the Tainos. Columbus returned from the Orinoco to the new Hispaniola capital of Santo Domingo at the end of August 1498 to find one of his appointees, Chief Justice Francisco Roldan, in open rebellion against Columbus's own brother, Bartholomew. Many of the ordinary Spaniards on the island sympathized with the or openly supported Roldan, and he won some converts among the Tainos, as well as by promising better treatment than they had so far received. The promise was empty. When Columbus eventually reached a truce with Roldan, and his confederates. One of the rebels' key points, to which Columbus reluctantly assented, was that they be granted whole Taino communities to labor for them. Not even this sad agreement could end the disorder in the Spanish colony, when the new appointed Chief Justice of the island, Francisco de Bolsadilla, arrived from Spain in August of 1500. He found 7 Spanish rebels hanging from the gallows in Santo Domingo, and 5 more slated for execution the next day, for with the help of Roldan, Columbus was suppressing a rebellion led by the old lieutenant of Roldan, Bobadilla, charged by Ferdinand and Isabella to investigate, among other reported problems, the rumored abuse of ordinary Spanish colonists by the Italian Columbus. Saw the corpses as proof that the rumors were correct. Overreacting, he seized the house and the belongings of Columbus, and by the end of the month seized Columbus himself, whom he sent back to Spain in chains. Despite this turn of events, in Spain, Columbus won the sympathy of the crown and permission to undertake a 4th voyage in 1502. Although he was to avoid visiting Hispaniola, which had been put under rule of the royal governor, Nicholas de Ovando, after a passage of only 21 days across the Atlantic to the island of Martinique. This high voyage, as Columbus himself called it, turned disastrous. First came a hurricane off of the south coast of Hispaniola, and then he turned south, following the long, thin shores of Central America. Came the worst weather Columbus had ever encountered in his long experience at sea. In a place called Veragua in modern Panama. He was led to expect great deposits of gold, but instead found torrential rains. He took refuge in a shallow bay where his 4 ships made leaky as sieves by worms, became landlocked for several months. One day, as Columbus, sick with malaria, lay alone on one of the vessels, the stress and distress of this high voyage overcame him. Climbing up the mast by a superhuman effort, he tried to shout to all the men on shore for help, but the surf drowned out his voice. Still on the mast, he fell asleep and experienced a vision or a delusion. I heard a very compassionate voice saying, "O fool, and slow to believe, and serve thy God, the God of all." In this trance, the voice assured Columbus that he had as much support from above as David or Moses, and that he should keep his faith. At last he departed on Easter night with the ships rotten, worm-eaten, and all full of holes. By the end of June, the holes in worse shape yet, and more bad weather and contrary winds behind them. The ships arrived at Jamaica, unable to go farther. Columbus sent one of his company, Diego Mendez, in a Caribbean Indian canoe to Hispaniola for help. It was a desperate measure, but Mendez made it across the sea in 5 days. Mendez carried with him a letter written in Jamaica in July 1503 by Columbus, a letter into which Columbus poured the acclimating despair of his final voyage, and the life of frustration and sorrow it seemed to summarize. As he contemplated Hispaniola, now removed from his control, he thought of his exhausted state, so different from what he had hoped for it. Rescued from Jamaica later that year, he never was rescued from the sadness that had overtaken him, and fate had reserved for him a lasting dignity. When he died in 1506, the hemisphere he had stumbled across in his search for Asia was about to be named for another Italian, Amerigo Vespucci, who had little to do with Europe's presence there. Several documents regarding the 4 voyages survived from Columbus's hand. The supposed journal of his first voyage is actually a summary prepared by the cleric and reformer Bartolome de las Casas, a letter sent by Columbus to Louis de Santangel, a royal official and an early supporter of his venture, provides a more authentic account and served as the basis for the first printed description of America, issued in 1493 in Spain and widely translated and reprinted across Europe. A memorandum regarding the second voyage intended by Columbus for the Spanish monarchs, whose responses to each point also survive, offers useful insights into the emerging ambiguities and problems of the colony on Hispaniola. For the third and fourth voyages, 3 letters come from Columbus, 2 sent to the crown, and 1 to a woman of the Spanish court, detail his deepening worldly and spiritual troubles. And then it's just 2 of the letters in this volume. From letter to Louis de Santangel regarding the first voyage, at sea, February 15th, 1493. Sir, as I know that you will be pleased at the great victory with which our Lord has crowned my voyage, I write this to you, from which you will learn how in 33 days I passed from the Canary Islands to the Indies with the fleet which is the most illustrious king and queen of our sovereigns gave to me. And there I found very many islands filled with people innumerable, and of them all I have taken possession for their highnesses, by proclamation made and with royal standard unfurled, and no opposition was offered to me. To the first island which I found, I gave the name San Salvador. Footnote. The precise identity of the Bahamian island Columbus named San Salvador is not known today, although many theories have been put forward. I gave the name San Salvador in remembrance the divine majesty, who has marvelously bestowed all this. The Indians call it Guanahani. To the second I gave the name of Isla de Santa Maria de Concepcion. To the third, Fernandina. To the fourth, Isabella. To the fifth, Ilawana. And so to each one I gave a new name. Footnote. Of these 4 islands, only the identity of Juana, Cuba, is today certain. reached Wana, I followed its coast to the westward, and found it to be so extensive that I thought that it must be the mainland, the province of Ch.2, footnote, Cathay, China or Cathay. So he was thinking it was China that he had gotten to. And since there were neither towns nor villages on the seashore, but only small hamlets with the people of which I could not have speech, because they all fled immediately, I went forward on the same course, thinking that I should not fail to find great cities and towns. And at the end of many leagues, seeing that there was no change, and that the coast was bearing me northwards, which I wished to avoid, since winter was already beginning, and I proposed to make it from it to the south. And as moreover the wind was carrying me forward, I determined not to wait for a change in the weather, and retraced my path as far as a certain harbor known to me. And from that point I sent 2 men inland to learn if there were a king or great cities. They traveled 3 days' journey and found an infinity of small hamlets and people without number, but nothing of importance. For this reason they returned. I understood sufficiently from other Indians, whom I had already taken, that this land was nothing but an island, and therefore I followed its coast eastwards for 107 leagues to the point where it ended, and from that cape I saw another island distant 18 leagues from the former to the east, to which I at once gave the name Hispaniola. Footnote: Hispaniola, where the countries of Haiti and the Dominican Republic are located. And I went there and followed its northern coast, as I had in the case of Wana, and to the eastward for 188 great leagues in a straight line. This island and all the others are very fertile to the limitless degree, and this island is extremely so. In it there are many harbors on the coast of the sea beyond comparison with others which I know in Christendom, and many rivers good and large, which is marvelous. Its lands are high, and there are in it very many sierras and lofty mountains, beyond comparison with the island of Tenerife, which footnote, the largest of the Canary Islands. All are most beautiful, of 1,000 shapes, and all are accessible and filled with trees of 1,000 kinds and tall, and they seem to touch the sky, and I am told that they never lose their foliage, as I can understand, for I saw them, as green and as lovely as they are in Spain in May, and none of them were flowering, some bearing fruit, and some in another stage according to their nature. And the nightingale, who was singing, and other birds of 1,000 kinds in the month of November, there where I went. There are 6 or 8 kinds of palm, which are a wonder to behold on account of their beautiful variety, but so are the other trees and fruits and plants. In it are marvelous pine groves, and there are very large tracts of cultivatable lands, and there is honey. Footnote: the honeybee, presumably the source of the honey found on the island, is not native to the Western Hemisphere. nor is the nightingale mentioned above. And there are birds of many kinds and fruits in great diversity. In the interior are mines of metals. And the population is without number. Hispaniola is a marvel. 1493. And I will save the letter to Ferdinand and Isabella concerning the fourth voyage for next Tuesday's read. And I hope everyone has enjoyed this episode. I hope you're able to join me again at 11 o'clock tonight with Wednesday reads. Viewer discretion is advised on Wednesdays. And I do hope you were able to learn something. I hope you were able to enjoy the Battle of the Pass of Thermopylae. I hope you were amused by Eothen and Mr. Kinglake's journey through going towards Constantinople. And I hope that everyone has... I hope that you have a wonderful All Souls Day, and that you remember your loved ones, and you are able to remember them with joy. So, I will see you next time. Have a good day, and thanks for watching.